Before you sign that contract, you should probably ask one question first. Who actually owns the forest beneath those cabins? I said those words quietly as I stood at the edge of Silver Pine Retreat, watching a crowd of investors admire 50 luxury cabins built among the trees that had belonged to my family for more than 50 years. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled the cold mountain air. New lumber, wet soil, and diesel from the construction equipment mixed together while sunlight reflected off the glass windows of cabins that were never supposed to exist. Around me, people laughed, shook hands, and took pictures beside a wooden sign that read Silver Pine Luxury Retreat. They thought they were celebrating the beginning of a multi-million-dollar success story. They had no idea they were standing inside the biggest mistake the HOA had ever made. My name is Nathan Cole, and I spent most of my life protecting forests, not fighting over them. I never imagined I would have to defend my own land from the people who claimed they were building something for the community. But that morning, as I watched Victoria Whitmore, the president of Silver Pine Estates HOA, walk between those brand-new cabins with a smile on her face, I knew the moment had finally arrived. Victoria had spent months telling everyone that this project would transform the area. She called it progress. She called it an investment. She called it a gift to the neighborhood. But there was one thing she never called it: my property. I kept my distance that day. I didn't argue with the contractors. I didn't interrupt the presentation. I didn't give Victoria the reaction she wanted. I simply stood there holding a small folder under my arm, feeling the weight of every document inside. Because while everyone else was looking at the cabins, I was looking at the closing table waiting only a few hours away. The same closing day Victoria believed would make her the most powerful person in the valley. The same day she planned to finalize the sale of a property she never legally owned. 3 months earlier, those woods had been quiet. The only sounds were the wind moving through the branches, the creek running behind the old trail, and my boots pressing into the leaves as I walked the land my grandfather passed down to me. Now, the forest was filled with construction crews, survey markers, and expensive vacation homes. Victoria believed she had already won. She believed paperwork, influence, and confidence could erase a person's ownership rights. What she didn't know was that I had spent those same months doing something very different. I had been listening. I had been documenting. I had been waiting. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't making noise when someone crosses the line. Sometimes the smartest move is letting them walk all the way to the finish line before you show them where that line actually was. And Victoria was about to discover that the forest she built her empire on was the one thing she never truly controlled. The forest was never just a piece of land to me. It was a timeline of my family written into the earth. Every trail, every old tree, every bend in the creek carried a memory that money could never replace. My grandfather, Henry Cole, bought those 180 acres in Montana back in 1968, when the nearest town was smaller, the roads were quieter, and people still knew the names of their neighbors. I was a kid when he first taught me how to walk that property. He would point out the different trees, show me where the wildlife passed through, and remind me that land was not something you simply owned. It was something you protected. The sound of his old work boots pressing into the forest floor is something I still remember. The smell of pine after a summer rain. The cold air coming off the mountain ridge in the early morning. The simple peace of standing somewhere untouched by the rush of the outside world. That was the place I inherited after my grandfather passed away. I was not looking for a business opportunity. I was not trying to build a resort or sell luxury properties. I just wanted to preserve the land that had shaped my family for generations. For years, I worked as a forest conservation engineer, helping communities manage natural areas and protect resources. I understood property lines, environmental rules, and the importance of doing things the right way. That was why the first signs of trouble bothered me immediately. It started with small things. Fresh survey markers appeared near the edge of my property. A few unfamiliar vehicles began traveling down the old access road. Then one afternoon, I found a group of people standing near my trees with blueprints spread across the hood of a truck. That was when I met Victoria Whitmore. She arrived wearing a perfectly pressed jacket, carrying a folder full of documents, and speaking with the confidence of someone who had already decided she was right. She introduced herself as the president of Silver Pine Estates Homeowners Association. Her smile was polite, but there was something calculated behind it. She told me their community had approved a new luxury retreat project. She explained that the cabins would bring value, tourism, and improvements to the entire area. Then she said something I never forgot. She told me that my forest was going to become part of something bigger. I looked at her for a moment and asked a simple question. What makes you think this is your land to develop? She did not hesitate. She opened her folder and showed me maps, plans, and agreements that looked official enough to convince someone who did not know what they were looking at. But I did know. I noticed the missing details, the unclear boundaries, the assumptions hidden between the lines. Victoria believed confidence was the same thing as ownership. I knew better. I told her the project needed to stop until everything was verified. She smiled, thanked me for my concern, and walked away like the conversation was already over. That was the moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision someone had already made without me. And if Victoria Whitmore wanted to turn my family forest into her greatest achievement, I was going to make sure she understood one thing first. The truth does not disappear just because someone builds over it. After Victoria Whitmore walked away from my property that afternoon, I expected the construction plans to disappear. I thought maybe someone would finally review the documents, notice the problems, and realize the mistake before it became something bigger. I was wrong. 3 days later, I heard the sound that told me everything had changed. The low rumble of heavy equipment echoed through the valley before I even reached the tree line. The smell of diesel drifted through the air, mixing with fresh-cut wood and damp soil. When I stepped onto my land, I saw workers clearing sections of forest that my family had protected for decades. Survey flags marked areas where the trees used to stand. Temporary signs pointed toward future cabin locations. It felt strange seeing a place that had always been quiet suddenly treated like a construction site. I walked up to the project manager and asked who gave permission to begin work. He looked uncomfortable, then pulled out a folder. He told me everything had been approved by Silver Pine Estates Homeowners Association. He said the permits were moving forward and the investors were excited. The problem was that none of those papers changed one important fact. The land still belonged to me. I contacted Victoria again, expecting a serious conversation this time. Instead, she arrived with the same calm confidence as before. She stepped out of her vehicle, looked across the property, and acted like she was already the owner. She told me the community had spent months planning this development. She said stopping it would hurt everyone involved. I asked her why she was building on land that was never transferred to the association. Her expression changed for just a moment. It was small, but I noticed it. The confidence faded. Then it returned. She told me that the ownership situation was complicated and that her legal team had already reviewed everything. That phrase stayed with me. Her legal team, not the county, not the original property records. Her team. Victoria was not asking whether she had the right to build. She was acting like the answer no longer mattered. Over the next few weeks, the project grew faster. More workers arrived. More materials were delivered. The first cabins began taking shape between the trees. Every morning, I heard the sounds of construction where I used to hear birds and wind. Neighbors started talking. Some believed Victoria was creating something impressive. They saw the beautiful designs, the expensive materials, and the promises of increased property values. They did not see the missing pieces hidden underneath. They did not know what I knew. I had spent years working with land records, environmental surveys, and property boundaries. I knew that a polished presentation could not replace legal ownership. But I also knew something else. If I challenged Victoria too early, she would simply call it a disagreement. She would paint me as someone standing in the way of progress. So I made a decision. I stopped arguing. I stopped warning her. I let her continue. Because every new cabin, every new document, and every public announcement was creating a clearer record of what she had done. Victoria thought she was building her future. She did not realize she was building the evidence I needed. And while she celebrated each step forward, I quietly prepared for the moment when the truth would finally catch up with her. The first time I saw the finished cabins standing between the trees, I understood exactly what Victoria Whitmore was trying to do. She was not just building vacation homes. She was building a story where she was the visionary leader who transformed untouched land into a luxury destination. A story where everyone would forget to ask the one question that mattered most. Who gave her permission to build there? By the end of the summer, the quiet forest I knew had become a construction zone. The peaceful sound of the creek was replaced by the constant movement of trucks coming and going. The air carried the smell of fresh lumber, concrete, and machinery instead of pine and wildflowers. Every week, another cabin appeared. Every week, another piece of my family's land was covered by a project that should never have started. Victoria made sure everyone heard her version of events. She held community meetings, shared glossy brochures, and talked about how Silver Pine Retreat would create jobs and increase property values. She stood in front of neighbors and investors with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. But I noticed something. She never talked about the actual property records. She never showed the original deed. She never explained the boundaries. She only talked about the future. That was her strategy. Keep everyone focused on what she was building, so nobody looked closely at where she was building it. I continued collecting information quietly. I reviewed every document connected to the project. I studied the permits, the surveys, and the agreements Victoria kept referring to. The more I looked, the clearer the picture became. The project was moving forward because people trusted the appearance of authority. They saw official-looking paperwork and assumed everything was legitimate. But documents are only as strong as the facts behind them. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the old property records spread out in front of me. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the sound of wind moving through the trees outside. I opened the original deed my grandfather kept protected for decades. The paper was worn around the edges, but the words were still clear. The property lines had never changed. The forest had never been transferred. The land was still exactly where it had always been. That was when I knew I had a choice to make. I could confront Victoria immediately and start a public fight, or I could wait. I thought about every conversation we had. Every time she dismissed my concerns. Every time she acted like my ownership was just an obstacle in her plan. I realized something important. Victoria was not expecting resistance. She believed I would become frustrated, give up, and walk away. She had built her entire strategy around the idea that nobody would challenge her. So I decided to let her believe that. I stopped showing up at every construction meeting. I stopped explaining the same facts over and over. I let the project continue while I prepared quietly behind the scenes. Because Victoria was making one mistake that people with too much confidence often make. She thought silence meant surrender. She had no idea silence was the reason I was able to see everything clearly. And while she prepared for the biggest business deal of her career, I was preparing for the moment when every person in that room would finally see the truth. The closer the project got to completion, the more confident Victoria Whitmore became. She started acting like the outcome was already written. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of her victory. New wooden signs marked the entrance. Fresh gravel paths connected the cabins. Luxury vehicles arrived almost every weekend as potential buyers walked through the property. The forest that once belonged only to the sound of wind and wildlife had become a showcase for a business plan built on assumptions. Victoria had created an image so convincing that many people stopped asking questions. But I kept asking them. That was the difference. I knew that appearances could be carefully designed. A beautiful cabin did not prove ownership. A polished presentation did not replace a legal document. And a confident person standing in front of a crowd did not automatically have the right to control someone else's property. While Victoria prepared for the final sale, I started digging deeper into every detail of the project. I requested copies of public records. I reviewed county documents. I compared the construction plans with the original property surveys. The more I studied, the more unusual things I found. The access roads connected through my land. The descriptions used in marketing materials stretched beyond the actual boundaries of the development area. The phrase, private forest experience, appeared repeatedly in advertisements, but there was no legal agreement giving them permission to offer that access. Victoria had built her entire project around something she assumed she could claim later. She had confused opportunity with ownership. I remembered the first day she stood on my property and told me the forest was going to become something bigger. At the time, I thought she simply did not understand the situation. Now I realized she understood enough to ignore it. That changed everything. I also started paying attention to the people around her. Some neighbors who originally supported the project began asking questions. They noticed that Victoria avoided discussing certain details. They noticed that every conversation focused on profits, but rarely on property rights. Slowly, the confidence around the project started to weaken. But Victoria did not see it. She was too focused on the closing day. She invited investors, scheduled presentations, and prepared the final documents. To her, that day represented the moment when everything would become permanent. To me, it represented something completely different. It was the moment when everyone involved would finally have to look at the facts. I kept the original deed, the updated surveys, and all my documentation organized in a folder that stayed with me everywhere I went. I did not need to make threats. I did not need to create a scene. The truth was already powerful enough. The hardest part was waiting. Every time I drove past the cabins, I saw the hours of work, the money spent, and the confidence Victoria carried with her. Part of me wanted to walk in and stop everything immediately, but I knew rushing would only give her another chance to control the story. She wanted a public argument. She wanted emotion. She wanted me to react. Instead, I gave her exactly what she expected least: patience, because by then, the project was no longer just a development. It was a record of every decision she made. And when the final meeting arrived, she would have to explain not only what she built, but where she built it. The week before the closing meeting, everything around Silver Pine Retreat moved faster than ever. Trucks arrived early in the morning. Workers carried the final pieces of furniture into the cabins. The sound of construction slowly disappeared, replaced by the quiet confidence of people who believed they had already succeeded. From the outside, it looked perfect. The cabins were beautiful. The views were incredible. The entire project looked like something designed for a magazine cover. But I knew something nobody else knew. The foundation of that success was built on a mistake. I spent those final days organizing every piece of information I had collected: the original deed, the property surveys, the county records, the communication between the homeowners association and the developers. Every document had a purpose. Every detail connected to the bigger picture. I was not preparing for an argument. I was preparing to present facts. That distinction mattered. Victoria Whitmore built her reputation on confidence. She knew how to walk into a room, speak clearly, and make people believe she had everything under control. I had seen it many times. She could turn uncertainty into excitement and questions into distractions. But documents did not care about confidence. Property lines did not change because someone gave a convincing presentation. The truth stayed exactly where it was. During my final review, I found the piece of information that changed everything. It was not a hidden secret or some complicated loophole. It was something much simpler. The original property agreement clearly showed that no transfer had ever taken place. The forest remained mine. The access rights were never granted. The development plans were created around an assumption that was never legally completed. Victoria had spent months building a luxury retreat based on something she believed would become true. But believing something does not make it real. I sat at my desk that evening looking out toward the dark outline of the forest. The same trees my grandfather planted decades earlier stood quietly beyond the window. The room was still. The only sound was the soft movement of the wind outside. I thought about how easily people can be convinced by appearances. A finished building, a professional presentation, a group of investors. Those things can make people forget to ask basic questions. Who owns the land? Who has the right to make decisions? Who actually signed the agreement? Those questions were coming. And they were coming at the exact moment Victoria thought she was finally safe. The closing meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at the main office of Silver Pine Estates. Investors would be there. Lawyers would be there. Victoria would be there, ready to celebrate the biggest achievement of her career. I knew walking into that room would change everything. But I also knew the most important part was not embarrassing Victoria or proving that I was right. The important part was protecting something that could not speak for itself. The forest, the land, the history that had been passed down to me. Victoria saw my patience as weakness. She thought I was waiting because I had nothing left to say. She was wrong. I was waiting because I wanted the truth to arrive at the exact moment when nobody could ignore it. The morning of the closing meeting arrived with a strange kind of silence. I woke up before my alarm, walked outside, and stood at the edge of the forest for a few minutes. The air was cold, the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost, and the only sound was the wind moving through the branches above me. For most people, it was just another piece of land. To me, it was the place where my grandfather taught me responsibility, patience, and respect for something bigger than myself. That morning, I put the old property folder into my truck and drove towards Silver Pine Estates. I knew everyone inside that building believed they were about to celebrate. I knew Victoria Whitmore had probably rehearsed every word she planned to say. But I also knew the facts were coming with me. When I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Investors stood near the entrance discussing the cabins. Real estate agents walked around with printed brochures. The atmosphere felt like a major business success story. Through the glass doors, I could see Victoria greeting people with the same confident smile I had seen many times before. She looked completely certain that nothing could interrupt her plans. I walked inside quietly. Nobody stopped me. Nobody knew why I was there. For a moment, I simply watched. I watched Victoria shake hands and talk about growth, opportunity, and the future of the valley. She described the project as if it had always belonged there. Then the meeting began. Victoria stood at the front of the room and thanked everyone for supporting her vision. She talked about the months of planning and the effort that went into creating Silver Pine Retreat. Every sentence sounded polished. Every word was carefully chosen. But there was one thing missing. She never mentioned the person whose land was underneath everything she had built. When the presentation ended, the investors moved toward the documents waiting on the table. That was when I stepped forward. The room became quieter. Victoria looked at me with a surprised expression. She recognized me immediately. "Nathan, I did not expect you here today," she said. I looked at the people around the room and then back at her. "I think I am exactly where I need to be." She asked if there was a problem. I opened the folder in my hand and placed the first document on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply explained that before anyone signed the final agreement, they needed to review the ownership records connected to the property. The room changed instantly. People who had been smiling moments earlier started looking at the papers. Victoria tried to stay calm. She said everything had already been reviewed by her team. She said there must be some misunderstanding. But misunderstandings do not survive official records. I placed the survey documents beside the original deed. I showed the property boundaries. I showed the information that had been ignored from the beginning. The forest had never been transferred. The development agreement was based on an assumption, not ownership. For the first time, I saw Victoria lose control of the conversation. She had spent months building confidence around her project. Now, she had to answer a much simpler question. How did she build an entire future on land that was never hers to sell? The room stayed quiet for several seconds after I placed the documents on the table. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize the story they believed might not be the real one. The investors looked down at the records in front of them. The lawyers started reviewing the details more carefully. Victoria Whitmore stood near the end of the table, still trying to maintain the same confidence she had walked in with. But I could see the difference. Before, she controlled the conversation. Now, the documents did. One of the investors asked a simple question. "Are you saying this property was never transferred to the association?" I answered calmly. "That is exactly what I am saying." The room shifted again. People started comparing the marketing materials with the actual records. The luxury cabins were real. The construction was real. The money that had already been spent was real. But the foundation of the entire deal was based on something that was never completed. Victoria quickly stepped in and explained that there had been discussions about future arrangements. She talked about intentions, expectations, and community plans. But intentions are not ownership. Expectations are not legal rights. And plans do not change a property deed. I watched as the same confidence that convinced people for months started to disappear. The investors were no longer looking at the beautiful cabins. They were looking at the documents that determined whether those cabins could legally be sold. The lawyers began asking Victoria questions she had avoided answering before. Where was the transfer agreement? Where was the recorded permission? Where was the document allowing the association to advertise private access to my forest? Every question created another problem. Victoria tried to explain that the project had moved too far to stop now. She pointed out the amount of work completed and the opportunities created. But that was exactly the reason I had waited. The bigger the project became, the more people needed to understand the truth before making a final decision. I did not want anyone to lose money because of something they did not know. I wanted the facts to be visible before the closing papers were signed. After reviewing the documents, the legal team recommended delaying the transaction until the ownership questions were fully resolved. The closing that Victoria had planned for months was no longer a celebration. It was a review of everything she had overlooked. Later that afternoon, I walked outside and looked back at the cabins from the edge of the property. The same buildings that once represented someone else's ambition now represented something different. They represented the importance of patience. They represented the value of keeping records and protecting what belongs to you. Victoria had spent months trying to convince everyone that she was creating something new. But the truth was much simpler. She had built an entire future on land she never had the right to claim. The next few weeks would bring investigations, legal discussions, and difficult conversations for everyone involved. But one thing had already changed. The people who once saw Victoria as the person with all the answers finally started asking the questions she hoped nobody would ask. Months after the closing meeting, the forest finally became quiet again. The constant movement of trucks disappeared. The sound of construction equipment was replaced by the familiar rhythm of nature. Wind moved through the trees. The creek continued running along the old path, and the land started to feel like itself again. The biggest change was not what people could see. It was what they finally understood. For months, Victoria Whitmore had convinced everyone that confidence was the same as authority. She believed that if she moved quickly enough, built enough structures, and created enough excitement, nobody would stop to question the foundation of her plans. But the truth had been there the entire time, sitting in old records and official documents. The forest had a history. The property had a boundary. And ownership was never something that could be replaced by a presentation or a promise. After the failed closing, the project went through a complete review. The investors who had been ready to move forward wanted answers. The county reviewed the development records. The legal teams examined the agreements that had been presented as complete. Every step brought more attention to the mistakes that had been ignored. Victoria eventually stepped away from her position with Silver Pine Estates Homeowners Association. The same confidence that once made people follow her decisions was gone. She had built her reputation around being the person who always knew best, but the one thing she never considered was that someone would patiently document every detail and wait for the right moment to present the truth. As for me, I returned to the forest. I walked the same trails my grandfather showed me when I was young. I ran my hand along the old wooden fence near the creek and listened to the sounds I had missed during those difficult months. I thought about how close everything came to being lost. Not because someone had a better claim, not because the law was unclear, but because some people assume that if they move fast enough, everyone else will simply accept what they create. That experience changed the way I looked at ownership. A piece of land is not just a line on a map. It is the responsibility connected to every decision made on it. It is the memories attached to it. It is the promise that what was protected before you will still be there for the people who come after you. I never wanted revenge against Victoria. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the truth to matter. I wanted the records to speak for themselves. And in the end, that was exactly what happened. The forest remained protected. The land remained where it belonged. And everyone learned a lesson that should have been obvious from the beginning. Real ownership is not about who talks the loudest or who builds the biggest project. It is about facts, responsibility, and respect. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with a warning. Sometimes it simply waits quietly until the right moment. And when that moment comes, the truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be seen.